webinar, and a webinar setting, you can only see the people who are presenting. So you can only give certain people the opportunity to be, you know, on the camera, so to say. Everyone else has very limited usage. So it's really incredible how there are so many different ways of using this technology. I just think it's incredible. And we've only used a few of them. I mean, not all of them are needed for us, but we can do polls. We can we can have closed captioning set up, which I've tried to play with, and it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, especially when there's Hebrew involved. It's very hard. But you can also set it up so that you have someone who is typing in the closed captioning at the same time. You assign someone to do the closed captioning. We can have the reactions. We can have, I'm trying to think of what other things I've seen. There's the screen sharing and all sorts of things like that. So. It's really incredible that this technology exists and that we're able to use it in this way. And of course, a lot of the students, a lot of younger kids have figured out ways to beat the system. We had one student who, not in Kol Yaladim, but Mark had a student in his school who took a picture of himself, kind of like this, screenshotted it, made it his background. So you see Sharon has a background, so you can see just the Kol Ami logo behind her. And then he was not in class. It just looked like he was frozen. And he skipped class. Unfortunately, that student was the child of a staff member and was not able to get away with it so easily. But I've seen a lot of things like that.
So Amanda Muniz, who uses the Hillsborough County school system Zoom, got hacked by some student from outside of her classroom that got into it and just totally took over her whole class. Mm-hmm. And the police have actually gone through and have found the person. So there was a real issue for her.
Yeah, there's been a lot of things like that. There's been a lot of Zoom bombing where somebody comes in. That's why we now have the passwords in the waiting room and all sorts of things like that, because someone will come in and figure out how to take over the class. They can take over the screen share, and if you do screen share, there's a way to do a whiteboard. They'll take over your whiteboard and start, you know, drawing things all over. And luckily, we figured out how to set up. That's why. So the password, we can pass out the password all we want. What really happens is the people who are Zoom bombing and things like that, they're just putting in random numbers for meetings, and then any meeting that doesn't have a password, they can just go right into. But as long as you have a password, you're pretty much protected from that. And you know, only the host can screen share, things like that.
Well, the thing is if you have a password and use the waiting room, people don't need the password to get in. The waiting room takes over.
Right. Right. All right, I think we're going to jump in. Are we ready for some halakha? All right. How many of us have had experience with halakha and Jewish law before? We've learned about it before. Just want to kind of get an idea. So we have a good number, but so what we're going to do, and I think at the beginning of this hour or however long we go, we won't go too long, maybe an hour 15. You probably are going to be able to educate me a little bit because we're going to look at law in general to start. So I want to think about, before we get into what actual law is, I want us to think about the word religion. So tell me about the word religion. Does anyone know any origins of it? So right in the middle of that word religion, we have L-I-G, lig. It comes from the same root as ligament or tubal ligation. So we have this Latin word, lig. I'm not sure how to pronounce it because I don't speak Latin. But what it means is it connects something to something else. It's a connection. And this is really the root of what religion is, a connection, which is not what we might think it is. What would we think a religion is?
A belief in something?
A belief in something.
Faith.
What was that?
Faith.
Faith, right? And that is still a connection to something, right? Faith and a belief in something is connecting you to maybe God. Maybe it's connecting you to other people in a community. It's connecting you to a belief system, right? And each religion has a way of connecting to that. And a lot of it is through what? How do we connect? Through prayer. What else?
Daily practices?
Daily practices.
Belief in a higher being.
Belief in a higher being. No law. None of it is a connection through
Rules.
rules.
Yeah.
Are maybe that's just a sign of either our community or it's a sign of times. That's not where we first went. So now I want to take a look at what are the values that drive a set of laws, a set of how a community functions, right? So it might be that we have a lot of overlap. So let's take a look at American values versus Jewish values. They might overlap in many, many ways. They might differ in a lot of different ways. And you can look at this through a theory of law. So a theory of law, you ask a series of questions to figure out where that law stands before you can figure out what the laws are. So one of my professors had given me a list of 7 questions you would ask. And we're going to go through some of them to think about kind of where Jewish law sits before we get to how it functions. So the first question you might ask is, what is the nature and status of individuals, of individual humans within, so individual humans or communities within that structure. So for American law, American values, where is the status of an individual or a community? What's driving this?
About life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's an individually driven, right?
Sorry, last night I listened to a documentary about Bohm, David Bohm, and he spoke about the unity, the oneness of everybody.
Okay, so now we
On
have
YouTube, yeah.
So now we have the divide between rights and duties. So what's the difference between rights and duties, which is a lot of what the American law is based on? And any lawyers here can correct me at any time, because the American law is not where I have my expertise. That's why I said you guys are going to educate me partly. So what's the difference between rights and duties?
It's exactly what the words are, Rabbi.
Okay.
You have rights are things you have the ability, the right to do. Duties are obligations, things you have an obligation to do. They often cross each other and they often conflict with each other, and you have to be careful how they conflict with each other and make sure, because a lot of people believe, I don't want to get into politics, but a lot of people today, they believe they have rights, but they really should be obligations.
Right. So the way I like to boil it down, you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but I'm just reviewing the notes I wrote down many years ago, which was, and this is the easy way for me to remember it, which was the rights are the things that the world owes you, and the duties are the things that you owe the world. Does that make sense? Does that work with the
Right,
definition?
right. The world, but the world sometimes is the obligation. Sometimes there are things you owe to the entirety, and sometimes there are things you owe to just other individuals.
Right. So I guess when I say that you owe the world, I mean the things that you are required to do, or the things that you should be doing. Okay. So how about with Judaism? What are the rights of, or what are the nature and status of individuals or communities within Jewish structure, Jewish law? Do you have rights in Jewish law? When we look at Jewish law, think about all the different laws that you know. Are they built out of individual or community?
Well, if you're a slave, you've got a right.
So you
right?
do have certain rights.
In the Jubilee year or the 7th year. Yeah.
Mhm. So I like to think of Judaism, the Jewish culture, as or Jewish values, is that we are a kahal, that we are a community that has mitzvot, and the mitzvot are for us all. We go back to this idea that we are born neutral, right? We are born with a yetzer hatov and a yetzer hara, a self-serving instinct, that's the yetzer hara, and a communal aspect, a want to do good. It's just communal, and you have to balance it, right? And it's with God that we can figure out which way we're supposed to go. Okay, so we have a little bit of a difference there, but it's still pretty close, right? We have mitzvot, their responsibilities that we're supposed to do, but we also are born with these understandings of what we're supposed to be doing. We have rights. Okay, so let's look at the role of law in our society. What's the aim? What is it supposed to do? What is law supposed to do in American law?
Keep organization.
Keep organization.
Avoid chaos.
Avoid chaos. I like that. What about in Judaism? What is the role of law there?
Serve God and treat each other appropriately. To summarize, ethical monotheism.
Okay, so to be moral, to
Connected.
serve God. What was that?
Connected to God. Connection.
Right.
Provide guidance and a path.
Provide guidance and a path to what?
To right and wrong.
To right and wrong. Okay. I think there's one word that we can use to boil it down, which is, well, there's two words. One could be shleimut, to wholeness, but I think that what we more commonly use would be to be kadosh. We're looking to be holy ourselves, to be a holy community, to connect ourselves with God. And so that's the purpose there. Is that different from keeping order? Does it do a similar thing?
I think so.
Maybe, right? They're just coming from different directions, perhaps. Okay, so let's look at the next question. What is the scope of a law? What is it? What topics does it address? What topics are beyond its jurisdiction? And how does the scope follow from its purposes in any given society? So what is the scope of American law?
I would say it's very public facing.
Very public facing, right? Are there things that the law cannot cover? Is there something that you have a right to in American law that that would keep the laws from covering you?
Thoughts, intentions, maybe privacy, and
Right.
all of the things covered in the Bill of Rights. Those would be the most basic.
Yeah, we have a right to privacy, and so it can't it can't rule what you do inside your own home, right? I mean, it can to a sense, but you have your privacy to do what you want to do. But when you are in public, it's a very different story, right? Things that you do that affect others, right? Now that's not necessarily the same in other countries' laws, right? So there are laws in other countries about what internet sites you can go on, or how many children you can have, right? That's something that's covered in American law, but in other places, not necessarily the case. Okay, so what about Judaism? What is Jewish law? What is the scope of Jewish law?
Everything in your life.
Everything in your life, right? Each of them works to make you holy, then it has to cover everything that you do, right? Okay, so next question is about authority. What gives the law authority?
Well, in the case of the government makes the laws, so they have the authority to make sure that you obey them. And in Judaism, we have God and rabbis who control the laws.
Okay, so I'm gonna that's a really good start, but I'm gonna push you a little bit. I'm gonna challenge you a little bit. Who is making you stop at that stop sign? Who's making you stop at that red light?
Well, ultimately, it's the government. I mean, there's also a component of peer pressure, but the creation, interpretation, and enforcement of the laws are government functions.
Right. So there's not going to be someone watching every single time you come to a stop sign, which brings me to one of my favorite phases, which is I totally paused. Anytime somebody rolls through, what does a stopping at the stop sign mean? But there is the possibility that there is somebody watching. There is somebody there might be a red light camera. There might be a police officer sitting right on the other side. And we have to have some sort of buy-in to that, right? We've made by being in America, we have made the agreement to follow those laws, or there are going to be these punishments, right? So that almost kind of has an authority. I want to also challenge a little bit the other side. So we do have God, but I don't know how many of you, God has not knocked on my door and said, you know, you were playing on your phone on Shabbat. You weren't supposed to do that. And I know it was kind of an emergency situation, but there's no really black and white, like it's really no gray here. It's not how it works, right? So God might have authority here. And certainly I'm not knocking on your door when you turn on your phone on Shabbat. So in that case, the rabbis aren't having full authority. So what is it that makes you follow Jewish law? What is it? Where's the authority there? Is it buying in the same way?
In Pirkei Avot, it says, choose yourself a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe.
So maybe it's whoever you've decided to learn from, that you've decided to connect to. Yeah.
It depends, Rabbi, on what you believe is the power of God. Because there's some people who believe that if they don't do right, that they will have consequences, not consequences from the government, but consequences either in their life, the way in which they're treated in their life, if they believe in the afterlife, the consequences in the afterlife, and therefore they follow those tenets. There are others who believe that this is a lot of what we talk about in the high holidays, which is, you know, your obligations to others, your obligations to God, and these are guideposts that you live your life by, and by virtue of living your life, you enrich your life.
Right. So I'm going to build on that. So let's think about our obligations to others. We joke in our family that Mark has an obligation. We wrote it out in our ketubah, and this is being passed down from my parents, to take out the trash. I don't take out the trash. Mark does that. What happens if he doesn't take out the trash? Am I ripping up our ketubah? No.
No, you take out the trash and yell at him.
Right. Or I just nag him until he does. But so what is driving him to take out the trash?
He has a social contract with you.
It's a
That,
social contract.
that you both have agreed to, and those are his obligations and you have yours.
Right, exactly. So he does it out of maybe the fact that he doesn't want to be nagged. He might do it because it's love. He knows that I do not like doing it. He knows that there are times where I won't do it. And so either he has the obligation to do it out of necessity or because he knows that it makes me happy. Right? Same thing in Judaism. We look at sacrifices, we look at the obligations we have to God. They make God happy. We do them. We made this covenant with God that we made a promise that if God does these things, we would do these things. God pulled us out of Egypt. We now have to do X, Y, and Z, right? What about the love part? Is there a love component in Judaism? Do we do things because we love God? No. Does God watch over us because God loves us? How do we know that?
Well, he tells us that from the in the Torah that he loves us and that we have to show him gratitude and to follow his ways.
Yeah.
So the issue is if you don't do it, is there going to be a consequence? Even though he threatens that there'll be a consequence.
Right. And we remind ourselves of these all the time. We sing Ahava Rabbah. We sing Ve'ahavta. God's love to us, our love to God. Right. Same thing at night. We sing Ve'ahavta. We also sing Ahavat Olam. Right. We have these our love for God, God's love for us. We're reminded of this all the time. Okay, next questions. The next two questions I'll ask them. I'm gonna want you to think about them, but we're actually gonna come back to them. So the next questions are, how are laws to be determined? That's where we're gonna focus later in just a moment. And how does the law maintain continuity and coherence? So those are the two things we're going to focus on, but I want to look at the last question on the list, which is, what is the relationship between law and morality? And then you can also add law and economics, law and art, law and custom. How does the legal system handle conflicts between conflicts of jurisdiction with another legal system? So how about in American society? Let's just take the moral question, because I think that's where we focus most. What does American law say about morality?
Well, much of U.S. law does come from the Ten Commandments.
Mhm.
And the Ten Commandments include moral things such as you shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, things of that nature that, and obviously not the belief in, not the obligation we have in the first commandment to God, but we do have freedom of religion in the United States, and that sort of relates to that in terms of our ability to do that. But yeah, to me, all countries, depending on where, no matter where they are, have some base of morality in them, but there's a different level of what's moral and what's not moral. I think our law in the United States is much closer to the morality law in Judaism and Christianity, obviously, than it is to many other religions around the country, and certainly what other countries do, countries that we may not favor.
So I want to look at one big difference in morality, because a lot of that is exactly where I would go. But there's one law that I learned a few years ago in a CPR class that I was shocked by, which is that if you find a stranger who is in distress, and you think that you need to give CPR, what do you need to do first before you do anything?
You have to notify them, to say something to them.
Right. You have to say, are you okay? You have to ask several times, are you okay? Do you want me to help you? So there are, and this was when I didn't fact check this today, but when I wrote these notes down for the last time I talked, not the last time, but when I wrote some notes down a long time ago, there were all but 4 states in the United States that have a law that allows you to not rescue. Because if you give CPR to someone without their knowledge, they couldn't respond, and something happens, they get a broken rib, it goes poorly, something else, they can sue you for saving them, right? So I know that's shocking.
No,
But
it's not shocking, Rabbi.
it's not
I mean,
shocking.
you're talking about a Good Samaritan law.
Right.
Many of the
Tell us
states have
about
Good
the
Samaritan laws.
Tell us about them.
Well, I mean, it's basically what you just said, that, you know, because of what you said, that the general law before you have this Good Samaritan law is the fact if you help somebody and when you weren't asked to help that person and you do harm, you now have exposure and that person can sue you and get damage and recover damages. Whereas what so many states have said, well, you know, that's not fair to the person who's coming to the aid of a person in distress. And so we're going to enact a law called the Good Samaritan Law, which basically provides protection against that in the potential liability of that person in the event that they cause damage. Now, if they cause under that law, and I've not read those laws as carefully as maybe I should, but you know, if you cause damage which you absolutely know would have caused damage, you know, you weren't really trying to help. So, you know, you think that by sticking a screwdriver into somebody's stomach, that's going to solve their problem, and it's clear that's not going to solve their problem, you're not in trouble. On the other hand, you know, it may very well be under circumstances that if someone's not breathing, sticking a screwdriver in their throat to open up their trachea to enable them to breathe may be reasonable under that circumstance. So I don't know, those are some examples.
So, and this could be a very long conversation. And it's fascinating to me that this is a law that we have to be thinking about in American law, because what would Judaism say?
You're obligated to help somebody in distress.
You're obligated to help someone in distress. You always try to save them. There might be damages afterwards, which is a whole other story, but the Jewish tradition would not fault you for trying to help, because that is that's the complete duty that you have, is to save someone else. Then there's a whole question of going beyond the letter of the law, right? So in Judaism, it is, you know, considered, sometimes you can actually go too far beyond the law, and it becomes hard to tell what you're doing. Okay, so I want to take a look at, I want to kind of put that aside, keep that in your head, as we start to look back at Jewish law, where it came from. So let's think all the way back to the beginning in Genesis. Bereshit. Is Bereshit a law code? Think about those stories that we have.
There's limited law in there, but be fruitful and multiply is an example.
Okay.
There's also the Noahide laws.
Okay. How are these laws told?
Through stories.
Through stories, right? So most of the laws in Genesis are not, you must do this. It's more of a suggestion. So let's take Cain and Abel. What do we learn through Cain and Abel?
Thou shalt not kill.
Yeah, don't murder. It never says that. It doesn't say you shall not do that. It just says, hey, this was a problem. This guy killed this other guy, and God seemed to have an issue with it, right? Be fruitful and multiply is a declaration, but there's no, I'm telling you, you have to do this. It's the suggestion that God gives, the you know, the drive after they're placed in Eden. What should they do? So the first actual laws that are outlined as laws that we get are not until the 10 Commandments, which is why they're such a big deal. We call them the 10.
Rabbi, what about the Milah? Isn't that an obligation in Bereshit?
I don't, it is to Abraham, but not to the entire Jewish people.
Yet
is-
yet his whole family does that. Yeah.
Right, to Abraham and his family. But they're not the Jewish people yet. They're Abraham trying to find connection with God, right? It's our origin story. The first time we get something where God says, this is what you should tell everyone who is ever Jewish after this, is in this structure is the 10 Commandments. And we have different kinds of laws when we get to the 10 Commandments. We have, you have to do this. There are no ifs, ands, or buts. This is what you do. And there are, so those are apodictic, which I can't say. And then when we get to Parshat Mishpatim, which we are also very familiar with, you have the casuistic laws, which are if X, then Y. If this happens, if you do this, you're going to get that, right? You have the back and forth of that.
Where does the law of the calendar come in? Is that before the 10 Commandments?
The law of the
Keeping a calendar.
I don't know.
Yes,
Why do you ask?
I was under the impression that was the first mitzvah that was given to the Jewish people.
Great. So mitzvah is different from law. Why would a mitzvah, why would a commandment be different than the way we consider laws?
well, I think there's certainly overlap, but
Lots.
the establishment of the calendar with regard to the festivals actually precedes the Exodus, is at the beginning of Exodus chapter 12.
Okay. He's giving an outline on how to live, and we later come back and say this is law, and we're going to get to that, how that worked. But the first time that we get this is what you must do, I think the way I read it at least, are these 10 Commandments. So when it comes to whether you're bound to do it, right? It's what you're bound to do versus what you are likely to do. So I want to think about where did I want to think about?
But I think
Yeah.
think that the laws of Pesach precede. I mean, we were still in Egypt at that point. It's well before we reached Mount Sinai. And those are promulgated as laws directly by God through Moses to our community, which was, well beyond the original 70 people and, 12 tribes.
Great. So I want to think about how law comes to be a little bit. So we have a couple of different ways that laws come to be. We have God saying, you're going to do this. We also have traditions that turn into laws and laws that turn into minhag, right? So something that might feel like a commemoration of an event turns into how you follow that law. And all of them are built out of that. If we don't, what would happen if before we had received the 10 Commandments, before we had made this covenant, what would happen if we hadn't followed Passover the way it's outlined in the Bible? Was there any retribution for that? For not following it?
I think one would risk being cut off from one's kin, cut off from Israel.
Right, so there is that risk, but not from God. God hasn't told us that yet.
Well, I think actually, God does say that, in part having to do with the removal of chametz. This is something that I studied with a certain rabbi in Tractate Pesachim. It's
True.
all about that.
Okay, but we haven't gotten the Talmud yet. So we haven't gotten that logic.
It's right in the Torah.
It's right in the Torah, but it's not, it is. And it says it shouldn't be found, and all of those things, they're not, it's not a moral code yet, I guess is what I should say. It's not a law code according to, it's not organized in any way, it's their experience. we start to, as we go through the Torah, it does start to become organized by God saying, this is what's going to happen. What's wrong with this is what you have to do, and that's the way it's going to be, or the other law that we saw, which is if you do this or you don't do this, you're going to get this or not get this. What's the issue with those laws?
People have to buy in. They have to believe that they make sense.
Right.
Which is, I'll be honest, for me personally, that's a lot of problems I have with Judaism. You know, in the world, generally in the United States, the laws generally make sense to me. A lot of the laws in Judaism don't make sense. And to me, I have a difficult time understanding why we have an obligation to do.
Great. So we're going to come back to that. What happens with the golden calf?
People didn't follow what was being told to do.
Right. Right. And
Well,
what
they lost faith. They lost faith.
they lost
didn't-
faith.
Yeah, they didn't believe. I mean, Moses was saying these things to them as to what was going to happen. They weren't happy with the direction that it was going, and so they lost faith and they turned back to where they may have been before, which was not the path that Moses wanted to take them or that God wanted to take them.
Right. And so they realized that this whole do it or else tactic was probably not going to work, right?
Wait, who realized that?
Yeah,
The authors of the Bible, however you want to view that, let's put it that way.
sorry, did they lose faith, or were they trying to reach God through a medium that they had known before in Egypt?
It could have been either way, but I think that what happened was, regardless, is that they rebelled. They didn't know how to act. They didn't know what to do. So they went back to what they did before and they said, this isn't working for us.
It's like, Rabbi, it's a lot like your kids. You know, when you're around, they're going to usually do the right thing. When you're gone, you know, now they don't necessarily have to follow those rules anymore, they think, because you're not around. I think, isn't that what happened in the golden calf? You know?
Exactly. And that brings us to Deuteronomy 4. So I'm actually going to share this somehow. I didn't bring this up, but I'm going to now. All right.
I'd like to follow up on Gary's question, because I agree with Gary that the younger generation, not only in religious law, but in just civil law and regular laws, they feel that they are immune from anything, any retribution, and therefore are not quick and easy to follow any of the laws. And that's why we have a lot of the younger people, there's a lot of chaos within their lives and they just don't follow anything. And it's.
So I would say that it is generational, but it's not necessarily just the young ones. We see this pattern throughout history, where a generation goes through something and has some sort of reaction to law and says, no, this isn't for us. This isn't how we view law. This isn't how we understand law. This isn't how we understand religion. We're going to get to this. And this happened in American laws, in American culture as well. We believe that it should be something else, or it's unfair, whatever it is, and they eschew it completely. And then their children either follow that because that's what they were taught, or they hold on tight to it. So we see a generation of American Jews who leave the old country and come to America and say, that was their world. I want to live in the new world. I want to do all of these things. And I have to work on Shabbat in order to make a living. I have to, and of course, this isn't all American Jews. This is just a subset of American Jewish culture. They raise children to think critically about what Judaism is, and that it's a culture because it's what we grew up in, but we don't have to follow those laws. And there are all different balances. It could be from everything from I'm not Jewish at all, we're going to go completely against it, to I'm going to go against it just enough to rebel. And then you have children and grandchildren who are going, no, I want to find meaning somewhere, right? So you have this going on and on and on. We actually see this is interesting. We see this happening in Germany. You have grandparents who are Nazis who believed strongly about what they did in World War II. You have children who are saying, I don't even want to admit that my parents were involved in that because I was so disgusted by what they did. And now you have grandchildren saying, I have to honor my past. And so that's where a lot of neo-Nazism is coming out in the world, which is to say, this was the past. This was obviously what they wanted to do. It was meaningful in their lives, and to honor my history, I'm going to look back at it. That's not to say that it's right, not to say that any of these paths are right, but we see this pattern in many, many different cultures over and over and over again. And I think that every community is in a different place in different waves, right? We're going to see that in just a moment. Oh, we're going through time really fast, and I have not gotten through a lot of what I wanted to do. We're going to see that in just a moment in the different movements of Judaism. So let's get to that really fast. So first, let's take a look at Deuteronomy 4. And now, O Israel, give heed to the laws and rules that I am instructing you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land of the Lord, the God of your fathers is giving you. You shall not add anything to what I command you, or take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I enjoin upon you. So what does this mean right here?
Well, I've always had a lot of trouble with this because I think there's a tie-in. Number one, if you look at the conservative interpretation of this, and I don't know how the other interpretations, the other movements interpret it, it really applies only to the avoidance of involvement or adoption of paganism.
Mhm.
But it's a very broad statement if you take it out of context. And if you do take it out of context, it tends to undercut rabbinic law. And
Right.
here comes the tie-in. The tie-in is that in order to accept the authority of the Torah, in other words, that these are laws from God, we have to accept the divine authorship of the Torah. And it's a slippery slope from there to divine inspiration to a couple of guys got together and wrote a book.
Okay.
I think, and I mean, I think this is a big deal. And I think that that's why this one verse here is so important in our understanding of Jewish law and Jewish tradition.
Great. So we have this chapter here sets up a lot of where Jewish law goes. We have this idea that you can't add or take anything away from it. And what does that mean? That this is now tied up as a little bow of this is the law. But we know that law has to change because societies change. We also have, where did the word go? We find it. We have within this text the understanding of knowledge, of wisdom, that that God is giving us the ability to look at our text. Here we go. Ushmartem va'asitem ki hiv chachmatchem uvinachtem. You have wisdom and discernment to other people's, right? So when you need to know what to do, you can ask somebody with experience. You now have the experience, you now have the wisdom in your hands to say, how do we make this work? What's the difference between chokhmah and bina? You have.
The one is knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
and the one is a greater understanding.
Right. So you have kind of a book knowledge versus an understanding of how it works in the world. And so this is what a lot of our halakhah will be based off of. So we have the Torah, and the Torah gives us kind of this framework. And then what happens?
Well, almost the next thing is a restatement of the 10 Commandments.
Mhm. What happens after the Torah? We have other ways of law, right?
We have rabbinic Judaism after the temple.
Right. So first we have the entirety of the Bible, right? We have prophets that then undo everything, right? That say that law is actually supposed to work in a very different way. We get through the Mishnah. We have the compilation of this commentary saying, what did all that stuff mean? We have the Talmud, where we have rabbis discussing that to say how specifically should we do it? We're going to get into the specifics of how this should work when we're not in Eretz Yisrael, when we're not in biblical communities. This all gets edited. A lot of it gets a lot of it gets left out. And so you have the Tosefta. You have these additional commentaries. Then we get different midrash. So a midrash is taking all of these laws that they discussed and saying, well, here's how we got here. Here's what it was. And these are passed down. These are oral law. They're passed down through generations. And so they have the same weight as Torah law, as if it was passed down on Sinai. We get through here, we get through our Gemara and trying to understand the law. And then, I'm trying to get through lots and lots of notes here. We start to pass this down, right? We now have people who are now going to take the Talmud as it's been redacted, and they're going to study that. So we have our Rashi, we have our Rishonim, and we have different places, France, Germany, Spain, they're all having all of these conversations of how these laws work in that area. So for example, let's say the Torah says on the third week of the month during Shabbat, you must eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. That sounds nice. What does that mean? The Mishnah is going to say, what's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? It's going to say it is it's going to say that a peanut, sorry, there's a lot of noise behind me. I'm going to close the door really fast. So the Mishnah is going to come and say a peanut butter and jelly sandwich means that you have a layer of some sort of bread, you have a layer of peanuts that have been ground, you have a layer of a fruit that's been ground, and you eat that. Now the Talmud's going to come along and say, that sounds great. Ron's heard me say this before, so I know he's laughing. I'm trying to give the condensed version here. Now the Talmud's going to come along and say, well, what does it mean by bread? Are we talking about like matzah here? Are we talking about an egg bread like challah? Does it have to be whole wheat? Does it have to be, does it have to be 2 slices of bread? Or can 1 slice of bread that's been folded in half be enough? Or if it's a flat bread, can it be rolled up? What does it mean by peanuts? Can it be any nuts? Or does it have to be specifically peanuts? What about the fruit, this fruit? Does it have to be specifically grapes? Does it have to be a specific color of grape? Okay, so it's going to go into all these different questions. And you're going to have a teacher who said, in my house growing up, what we did is we always had 2 pieces of bread. We always had peanuts that were completely smushed until they were smooth. And we always had a fruit compote that was made with red grapes. And that's how we did it. And that's what we passed down. And then you're going to have another rabbi and say, well, in our family passed down, it was any kind of bread, whatever we wanted. And we had nuts. We still had nuts. We weren't able to grind it down enough. We didn't have enough time before Shabbat to do that. And so it had some bits of chunks in it, right? So these are the conversations they're having in the Talmud. Great. Now we're going to get to these Rishonim, and they're going to say, that's nice, but we don't have peanuts in our region. Our region only makes walnuts. Can you make a walnut nut spread? Or it doesn't work because it's too expensive to make red grapes all the time. it's really okay if you have this kind of jelly, right? So these are the kinds of things that they're going to get into. This goes on, and they continue to debate this. Rashi's grandchildren debate him on this. They say, "That's nice, Grandpa, but."
Sorry.
And Mark, do you have to leave right now?
No.
Okay.
All right.
Can you leave in like 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry for interrupting.
Okay, so look at the time. So this continues on, and now you have the Rif. The Rif comes along. This is Rabbi Yitzchak ben Yaakov al-Fassi. We call him the Rif. He's in the 1100s in Morocco, and he's going to take out anything that isn't Halakhah. He just says all of that other story stuff, not needed right now. We just need to know what the law is. He just gives the answers at the end. He's just going to list it all out, and then he's going to say, and this is what we do here. It's not really accessible. It's not understandable in a lot of ways. My professor, I wrote a note saying that my professor said, if you're going to study the Rif, you might as well just study Talmud, because it gets very confusing. But based off of that is Rambam, right? So we have Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon. He is Sephardic. He is in Morocco and Egypt, and he's going to come along and say, we need to make this more accessible. We need to just show what you're supposed to do. So he rewrites everything, and people still look at this. It's still considered one of the greatest pieces of halakha, and he just wants to make it understandable. He's going to use the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. He's going to use the Talmud and say, this is how it works. This is how it works if you're in Israel. This is how it works if you're outside Israel. This is how it works if we had the temple. This is how it works if we didn't have the temple. We're just going to write all of it, right? Then we get these grandchildren, right? The Tosafot. They're going to come along and they're going to say, that's nice, but this is how it works nowadays. And we start to get all of these people who are starting to look at the halakha in different ways. They're going to give us the way in which it is easiest to comprehend in their society in that time. And this continues on. So what's interesting is that in that Jewish communities really governed themselves for the most part, right? You lived in a small community. This is what you did. If you had a question, you would ask your rabbi. The rabbi would have an idea of what to do. And if they didn't, they figured it out, right? They took what they had, what knowledge they had from different sources. Maybe they wrote to another rabbi who would give a tshuva, an answer. But for the most part, they governed themselves. And this is the way it was until 1945 for the most part, that we lived in areas where we figured out what was best for our own community. And that's why we have different minhagim, different understandings, different traditions within each halakha. That's why a taco might be considered a sandwich in one place, but in another place you would never have a taco. It has to be peanut butter and jelly on rye. So this was one of my favorite examples of this. The first day of my halakha class, the teacher invites everyone to stand up for kiddush. He says, I want you, or no, that's not what he did. He says, I need someone to come up here and do kiddush for Shabbat. So one person came to the front of the room, they stood up, they had their glass in their hand, they sang Bishamru, they sang Borei Pri Hagafen, and then at the end, everyone said Amen. They sat down and they drank the wine. And the teacher said, well, okay, does anyone have a different way of doing it? Is there another way? And someone said, oh, me, definitely. And this person stood up, came over here. They have their cup in their hand like this. They say the whole thing. And then at the end, they raise their glass and say L'chaim, and they take a drink. And our teacher said, great, anybody else? Somebody else came up and they said, no, you have to do it sitting. No, 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 you have to sing this part. No, 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 you have to do this part out loud. Everyone has to say L'chaim as loud as possible. There were a ton of different ways. And at the end, the teacher said, you're all right. All of you, you're all correct. These are what seem like laws, because sometimes minhag, tradition, is just as important as law. And some of it, and they feed each other. Okay, so let's get to back to our continuity and change, because things start to happen. We realize that law has to change, that law is continuing to change, and we start to see these different structures. So for example, we get we have enlightenment, right? People are enlightened, you have information, you have different ways of getting information, and all of the movements start here. They really start in this space in the mid 1800s. And you see orthodoxy. You have Samuel Raphael Hirsch. He is in Germany. He says you can be modern, you can go to college, you can go to university, but the moment that something you learn in university is something against Judaism, God has precedence. God trumps whatever you've learned, right? As soon as you learn something that is not within the realm of what Judaism says, you have to forget that you learned that. So you can be modern up to a point. Okay. Then you have the Reform movement. You have Abraham Giger. He comes in and says, well, there's different stages. You have the Bible, you have the biblical stage with Moses, and then you go up to the prophets, because the prophets come in and say, we're not interested in religious practice. That's not what God wants you to do. We want you to just be ethical. We just want you to be moral. When we listened to the prophets, that's when we were best. Because after the prophets, when the rabbis came, people started to get angry at each other, and it was really hard to follow those laws. That's not what we need to do. When we moved forward to medieval times and people were excommunicated because of religious practice, that wasn't very good. We got to move back to what the prophets did and get rid of all of those laws and say that's not part of what we do. If it's moral, we follow those laws. So that's where Reform movement comes along. Then you have Zacharias Frankel. So Zacharias Frankel leaves the Reform movement because of a lack of use of Hebrew. So one of the things that the Reform movement was doing is saying, we don't need Hebrew. We have our own language. We have German. We don't need to hear a sermon in Hebrew. We don't know Hebrew. We don't know what the prayers mean. We're just going to do it all in our local language. And Zacharias Frankel says, I don't feel like that's right. I feel like we're missing something. We're missing something by getting away from that holy language. And he also wants to maintain the integrity of Judaism in changing times. He wants to hold on to all of these Torah laws, all of this thousands of years of history, while also going to college and learning about science, right? So he wants to do all of those things. So how do you both be traditional and modern is the question that Zacharias Frankel asks. So he goes into progressive revelation. So there's progressive revelation and there's continual revelation. So progressive revelation, which is what the Reform movement was doing, was we know better than our ancestors. We know better than what they were doing. We can change it. We can make it better. Zacharias Frankel says, no, it's continual revelation. The times change and the laws can work with them, but we don't have to eschew all of it. We don't have to get rid of all of it. Then comes the Pittsburgh platform. So the Pittsburgh platform comes along. What's happening is we have this. So first, Zacharias Frankel opens up his own seminary in Germany called the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he is teaching this idea. So everything starts moving to the United States, and they open up a liberal Hebrew college, and they decide to have a big celebration banquet. You may have heard about it. It's often known in conservative Judaism as the Treifa banquet. I have a picture here of the menu. I'll read some of it to you. They served little neck clams. They served consomme royale potatoes. They had, let's see here, soft shell crabs, shrimp, frog's legs, beef, ice cream, cheese platters. A little bit different than what we would serve today, right? And so a group of people at this banquet says, this is not Judaism. This is not what we're trying to do. We don't want to walk away from all of it. We want some of this to stay. We want some of it to be, we still want to follow some of this because it's what was passed down to us. The Pittsburgh platform comes along and dismisses all Mosaic and rabbinical laws. Diet, purity, dress. It says this is not who we are. And it essentially is the beginning of the Reform movement because you had those who thought like Zacharias Frankel, who wanted to maintain that Jewish integrity. And here we see the birth of the American Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. A quick side note, which is that recently, just a few years ago, there was a rabbinical school opened in Germany. Again, it was led by the conservative movement by the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, named the Zacharias Frankel Seminary. So that is now there's now once again a liberal, progressive Judaism, rabbinic law based school there. Okay, so now we have the Jewish Theological Seminary. They're starting to create conservative rabbis, and they have to figure out how we're still going to do law. What are we going to do? They create the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards in 1935, I believe. And this group looks at each of our laws. They take it step by step. They go back to the Torah law, they walk through, and they figure out how things have changed. So for example, a lot of the texts surrounding women in Halakhah have to do with the fact that women were just exempt from everything, right? Women had other responsibilities. They had to be busy with taking care of children and making food and things like that. They didn't have the time to follow positive time-bound commandments, such as prayer and things like that. They had issues of nidah, of purity or impurity, because there wasn't an understanding of what a menstrual cycle was or what it was happening, because blood was just considered impure. And so women weren't necessarily told they couldn't do it. Women were just exempt from it. But there were also different statuses of women based off of history, right? Women didn't have higher status jobs in companies. Women stayed home. But now you get to the 1980s and women certainly have business jobs. They are certainly using techniques like the microwave to help us take an easier approach to cooking in the home, and men are taking more of an equal status in taking care of household duties. So this exemption from prayer really doesn't hold the same weight. So they looked at the Torah text, they looked at how things had changed through time, and now we have an important phrase. The phrase, we have these different phrases that help us define laws. And the phrase here is Hilchete Kabitraim. So you follow whichever is the most recent authority. So if you can find in the text a place where they say, well, yeah, a laffa can be the bread for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, then you now know that you have the permission to use a laffa as a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and you can probably use that to say, well, a laffa is very similar to a pita in this way, or to a crepe in this way, and so therefore, if it's flat, then you can still use it as a bread. So,
Rabbi, can I ask for a clarification?
yeah, sure.
Um, the discussion about halakha is only about rabbinic law and not Torahic law. Is that right? I mean, we're not changing Torahic law, or am I wrong?
Right. So we're not changing what the Torah says. We're because we can't change the law, right? There are places where you would have something called a takana. So a takana is used only in extreme circumstances. It is very rarely called upon, but a takana is a declaration of sorts. It really means to fix or repair. It's changing something, and it's only used in extreme places where you might be in trouble if you do something like this, or I'm trying to think of a good example of this. So sometimes it's listed as a change. So let's see.
Well, there's polygamy, and then there's the fact that ultra used to be considered parv, and I think those were each changed by means of takana.
Right. Those were both by and it's usually done in the service of something else in order to be able to create change in a specific way. So in the Mishnah, it says there's a change in law in the name of tikkun olam, and the tikkun is that in order to keep peace, you can allow for a divorce. It's for the sake of tikkun olam. And so that comes up. There's the polygamy, right? It was not allowed in the land which they were, and so therefore you had to change the law, right? But it's only done in very specific cases where there's no other way of going around it. It's not easily done. So if we look at the CJLS, so they created the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. The CJLS is a group of 25 rabbis who are voting members. They have 5 lay people along on their committee, and they participate in these deliberations, but they don't necessarily have a vote. And people write in questions. They say, what is the status of blank? What should we do? Are we allowed to drive on Shabbat? Because people are moving away from their synagogues. They're not living within blocks. We're not living in cities. We're living in suburbs. People are becoming more spread out. They want to be able to drive to shul on Shabbat. We know that you can't drive because of creating a fire. Creates a fire.
So wouldn't that be a takana? Because aish is a prohibition, a Torahic prohibition, and when you turn that key in the car, you're creating a fire.
Great. So this is where you have several different laws that bump up against each other. Because while you do have this law that you have to that you can't create fire, the question is, well, was that fire already there? The question becomes, there's also this idea of being in community, that you're required to pray in a minyan, that you have to have a minyan in order to read Torah, to say Kaddish. And do you eschew being in a minyan, or do you light the fire, right? Which one do you do? How about, let's take a different one. What about, and here's where they get a lot of precedence for these kinds of questions. On your wedding night, are you required to go, we're gonna put the wedding one in, take that one away. A loved one has passed away. You have the requirement to take care of that person, to arrange for a funeral, to make sure that they are watched over for Tahorah. These are all mitzvot. You also have the obligation to pray. So do you walk away from those obligations in order to say the Shema? No, you have to figure out which one has more weight. And so this is what we grapple over every time we look at a new halakhah. Which one takes precedence here? And there are a lot of times where this takes place. Is it more important to pray in a minyan, or is it more important to not light that fire and just stay home?
Rabbi,
Can I make an assumption then that every community, every group, every person individually gets to literally choose what they want to do and draw their own lines?
Great. So, yes and no. So what happens is the committee will start to walk through the Halakhah, walk through from Torah all the way up to modern times, using all these different texts. And of course, each person has a different way of understanding Halakhah. They have a different way of understanding how the law should work versus what the scope is and what the authority is and where the authority comes from and all of these things. So you might have 4 different opinions on one question. You might have one that says, yes, you definitely should be able to drive. We're just gonna say, don't worry about it, just get in your car and go. You're gonna have one that says, yes, you should be able to drive, but only within these certain restrictions, right? You can only drive to the closest synagogue. You can only drive to shul and back, nothing else. You can only drive, but you can't park at the synagogue, right? So you might have a bunch of different things. You might have one that says, definitely not. We definitely cannot do that. You cannot drive. But well, I'm not riding a bicycle. I think bicycles are okay because look at this and this and then, So you might have that. Or you might have one that says, absolutely not. You cannot drive. You can only walk. You cannot break any of the rules. So all of these 4 ideas, that all these papers, so they're all peer reviewed. They're discussed over and over and over again. They make sure they get any of the things out of it. They are voted upon. And it's not that they're going to pick one of them. They're going to vote yes or no on each of these. So as long as you have 6 people say that it's okay, say yes, then it has passed. But what happens when all 4 of them pass? Now we have someone called a Mara D'Atra. The Mara D'Atra is the head of each community who decides. So each synagogue has a Mara D'Atra. In our case, it's the senior rabbi, it's me. In the case of a school, it might be the school rabbi. Some schools say, we're going to just use whichever synagogue we're attached to, right? It might be you might say, well, that might be the Mara D'Atra of the synagogue, but we have to have a Mara D'Atra in our home. So one of my favorite examples of this is Rabbi Elliot Dorff. He is currently the chair of the CJLS. He has written many, many, many laws. He's the one who taught me all of this. There was a tshuva that came up a few years ago about eating kitniot on Passover. Can you eat legumes? What are considered legumes? Can you eat rice? It's certainly a Sephardic culture. People do it all the time. There are many people who are Sephardi, who are conservative Jews. Why can't Ashkenazi Jews eat kitniot on Passover? And so they passed something saying it's certainly okay. There is nothing wrong with it. The way that we process kitniot in the United States ensures there will be no chametz in your black beans as long as you eat them from dried beans, not canned beans. It is fine, and you have to go through them before to make sure that there's nothing there. Rabbi Dorff passes this. He says that is great. He passes it down to his son-in-law, Rabbi Adam Kligfeld, who was my mentor. I had my internship with him. He is the rabbi of the synagogue, and he says, no, it's not going to fly here. That's not really what we're going to adopt because we are a mostly Ashkenazi synagogue. We believe in minhag over halakhah sometimes because it's such strong. That's not what we're going to do. Rabbi Dorff is a member of that synagogue. So he knows when he's at the synagogue, he won't be doing that. So then he goes home and says, I want to still do this. I think it's really important. And his wife goes, I don't think so. It's my kitchen. I'm not bringing kitniot. My mother didn't bring kitniot. My grandmother bring kitniot. We're not bringing kitniot into my kitchen. So Rabbi Dorff, who passes a law saying kitniot are fine, so also has to not eat kitniot in his own home because he has a different Mara D'Atra in that case. So yes, we have different cases where we follow different things. And this is what we see going along. And that's why we're able to have a synagogue where we have people who walk to shul. We have people who will drive, but only to shul, or only in certain cases. We have people who have no problem driving and then driving somewhere else. We have different levels of that law. And that's what we're going to continue to look at over our next 2 sessions. Thank you for learning with me. Next time we meet, we will talk about some modern tshuvot. What are the things that we've looked at? How did we get here? Why are we able to have our minyanim on Zoom? What about streaming the services and how all of that works? And we'll talk about some of the other things that the CJLS is taking on right now. Any other questions? I know we can probably go on with questions for a long time, and I know I speak really quickly, and I appreciate you trying to keep up with me.
Rabbi, I have a comment, because
Yes.
this has been my view for many, 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 many years. You may not like to hear it, okay? But I don't necessarily, I believe that when the standards have made the determination that various things, all of them are correct, you could do any of them that you want. I believe that the congregation should be making that determination, not the rabbi. The rabbi should be guiding the congregation in making that determination, but it should not be the rabbi who dictates when it's all permissible. If it's not all permissible, it should be the rabbi to make the determination. I feel very strongly about that. That has not always been the case at Kolami, and that's not always the view of others at Kolami, but that's certainly the view I've always had.
Great. So the role of the Mara d'Atra has been changed over time, and a lot of it has to do with what decade you learned in during your time in rabbinical school. So that's exactly what we were taught to do, that you have a ritual committee for a reason, that you have to, especially when you're moving into a new community, you don't know what their minhagim have been. You don't know where they have been for many years or what they've gone through, or you might not necessarily know what the makeup is the community. And so the rabbi is there to help guide the conversation, to help decide. So there might be firm lines where you say, this isn't what we're going to do because this isn't within the scope of conservative Judaism, even if you have been. I can tell you plenty of stories where the synagogue made a certain halachic decision based on wrong information, and the rabbi comes in and says, we have to re-kasher the entire kitchen. Some of that had to do with firm lines, and some of it had to do with someone made a mistake. So in my case, I learned you work with the community. You work and you figure out what's best for this particular group. And that's why a lot of the things that we'll be discussing in the next 2 sessions are so hard, because we haven't had to deal with it before. Right? When it comes to how to have a minyan over Zoom, it's something that the conservative movement has looked at because they have. It's something that we've dealt with in the past because there have been pandemics in the past, but we as a congregation haven't had to deal with that. And so we have to figure out where we are as a congregation to make that right. So that's what we're going to look at. So that's certainly my take on it, is that I have to talk to people. I can't just say, this is what we're going to do. We have to work on that together, and I can bring the sources to teach about it so we can learn about it and figure out what we believe. One of my teachers liked to say, I'm so sorry my generation ruined it for you guys. He said, we learned in rabbinical school that this is how it is, and this is how it's supposed to be, and we went out into congregations and we told it this way, and I think we just messed it up. And so he would tell us, you need to work with other people, you need to listen, you need to understand. And so that's certainly my take on it, but that's not everybody's. And everyone has their lines, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good
Thank you,
week.
Rabbi. This is very
Thank you,
good.
Rabbi.
I'm so glad. I'll see you
Thank
soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a great Sunday.
Sharon, see you at 2:45.